Welcome to the deep dive. Today, you're joining us as we dig into the story of a pretty intriguing dinosaur, Anoplosaurus.
That's right.
Our main source here is the Wikipedia entry for the genus, and basically our mission is to figure out the story behind this creature, the one they call the unarmored lizard,
Mhm.
and, understand its place in the whole world of dinosaurs.
Yeah, exactly. And it might seem, well, pretty straightforward on the surface, but the history of Anoplosaurus, it's actually a fantastic example of how our understanding of, like, the prehistoric world really develops.
How so?
Well, it's full of twists, turns, reassessments.
Yeah.
As new evidence pops up or old finds get looked at again with fresh eyes.
Okay, let's start right there with the name because it is a bit of a head scratcher. Anoplosaurus. It means unarmored lizard, right? From the Greek.
That's it, unarmored lizard.
Now, you might picture something, I don't know, sleek, maybe just scales. But here's the really interesting part. Anoplosaurus is now considered an ankylosaur, part of that group of heavily armored dinosaurs. So how did we get this apparent contradiction?
Well, the key really lies in that initial discovery. Back in 1879, when Harry Govier Seeley first described the fossils,
Okay.
there were simply no armor plates, no scutes, found directly with the skeleton.
Ah, okay.
So based purely on the evidence he had right then, an armored lizard was, well, perfectly logical.
Even if it turned out not to be quite right later on?
Exactly. It just shows how those early conclusions, they're often drawn from, incomplete information.
Right. So let's dig into that discovery then. Where and when did this actually happen?
Okay, so it's around 1878, maybe 1879, in a place called Reach in Cambridgeshire, England.
Cambridgeshire, okay.
Yeah. And Harry Govier Seeley, he unearthed this collection of bones, but they were disarticulated.
Meaning, like, not joined together, scattered.
Pretty much, yeah. Not connected like a neat skeleton.
Yeah.
The find included, let's see, fragments of the left dentary, that's part of the lower jaw, vertebrae from the neck, the back, the sacrum that fused bit in the hips, parts of the shoulder girdle, some broken humerus, upper arm bone pieces.
Wow, quite a mix.
Oh, yeah. Part of the left femur, thigh bone, left tibia, shin bone, some foot bones, ribs, and, other bits and pieces.
And what did Seeley make of this jumble of bones initially?
Well, his first thought, his speculation, was that maybe it belonged to a juvenile.
Ah, because of the size.
Probably, yeah. He estimated it was only about 5 feet long, maybe.
Yeah.
And so he named the type species Anoplosaurus curtinotus.
Curtinotus. What does that part mean?
That comes from Latin and Greek roots, meaning short back.
Short back.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, but the plot thickens a bit here, doesn't it? Because there wasn't just one species named right away.
No, that's right. We
Yeah.
also get Anoplosaurus major, the larger one.
Right. What's the story with that one?
Well, this is where you really see science kind of correcting itself. In the same year, 1879, Seeley also named Anoplosaurus major. Now, this was based on a neck vertebra and 3 partial tail vertebrae that he actually pulled out of some other fossils that had previously been assigned to a different dinosaur, Acanthophilus stereocercus.
Okay, so he reassigned them.
He did, but here's the catch. Anoplosaurus major is now considered chimeric.
Chimeric, like the mythical creature.
Exactly like that, yeah. Think of it like a fossil Frankenstein's monster, made up of parts from different animals.
So a paleontological chimera, what parts were mixed up here?
Well, it turns out the neck vertebra, that actually belongs to an ankylosaur, so okay, maybe close.
Right.
But the tail vertebrae, they came from a totally different group, an indeterminate iguanodont.
An iguanodont, so one of those big plant-eating ornithopods.
Precisely. Yeah, like iguanodon or related forms. So this whole situation with A major, it really highlights something key about paleontology.
What's it?
That those early interpretations, they're often based on, well, pretty limited evidence sometimes. And it takes more research, more comparisons to piece together the accurate picture. Science is always evolving.
Definitely. So Anoplosaurus major was basically a case of mistaken identity, fossil-wise. But what about the original one, Anoplosaurus curtinotus? Its classification seems to have gone on, well, quite a journey, too.
Oh, absolutely. A real roller coaster. Initially, Seeley just put Anoplosaurus broadly within Dinosauria.
Okay, general dinosaurs.
Yeah. But even then, that name, unarmored lizard, kind of hinted at maybe some connection to armored dinosaurs like Solidosaurus or maybe Polacanthus.
So the idea was there early on.
The possibility, yeah. And pretty soon after the discovery, other scientists started thinking, maybe this actually is some kind of armored dinosaur.
But it didn't just slot neatly into that category, did it? There were some detours.
Oh, definitely some detours. In 1902, you had Baron Franz Nopso weigh in.
Nopsa, right. Important figure.
Very. And he proposed a different idea. He actually reassigned both Anoplosaurus species to the genus Acanthophilus.
Oh, okay. So they became Acanthophilus cretinotus and Acanthophilus major.
For a time, yes. But then Nopsa himself, in 1923, he kind of shifted his view again. He suggested that, well, maybe some of the remains belong to Acanthophilus, but others should be placed with Camptosauridae.
Camptosauridae, so back towards the ornithopods, like Camptosauridae.
Exactly. So for a while, Anoplosaurus was actually thought to be related to those plant-eating ornithopods.
Oh,
Quite a jump from the armored dinosaurs.
wow. Yeah, that's a big shift.
It really is. And that idea, the ornithopod connection, it actually gained some traction for a bit. It, evolved slightly as people understood iguanodontian relationships better.
So it shows that classifying these extinct animals isn't always simple.
Not at all. It can involve, significant debate, shifts in thinking within the scientific community.
Yeah.
All driven by new data or just reanalyzing old bones with new knowledge.
And the classification chaos didn't quite stop there, did it? I see notes about some later attempts to, rename other dinosaurs as species of Anoplosaurus.
Ah, yes, more taxonomic tangles. Later on, in the 20th century, 1964, Oscar Kuhn renamed a dinosaur called Synganosaurus macrocircus to Anoplosaurus macrocircus.
Okay.
And then, just a few years later, in 1969, Rodney Steele did something similar. He renamed Eucercosaurus tanispondylus to Anoplosaurus canispondylus.
Why did they do that?
Well, presumably they saw similarities they thought warranted grouping them. But here's the thing. Both Synganosaurus and Eucercosaurus are now considered nomina dubia.
Nomina dubia, that means doubtful names, right?
Exactly. Latin for doubtful names. It basically means their original fossils are too incomplete or poorly preserved to confidently say what they are or assign them definitively to a genus.
So if the original names are doubtful...
Then renaming them under Anoplosaurus doesn't really work either. Those renamings are considered invalid today.
Got it. So those were kind of dead ends, scientifically speaking.
Pretty much. But they do show how scientists are always trying to make sense of the fossil record, trying to fit pieces together, even if sometimes those pieces, well, they don't quite fit where they're initially placed. It really shows the complexity, the sometimes messy nature of figuring out evolutionary history.
Absolutely. Okay, so after all those twists, all those turns in its classification journey, what is the modern view? Where does Anoplosaurus sit now in the dinosaur family tree?
Right, so the big turning point, the clarification, really came in 1998. There was a very thorough re-examination of the original Anoplosaurus cretinotus material.
Who did that?
Xavier Pareda Superbiola and Paul Barrett. And their detailed analysis led them to a pretty firm conclusion.
Which was?
They concluded that the remains actually represent what they called a primitive or basal member of the Nodosauridae.
Nodosauridae. So firmly within the armored dinosaurs, the Ankylosauria.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Back where some early thoughts hinted it might belong. Think of basal here as being near the root of the Nodosaurid family tree, representing some of the earlier, maybe less specialized forms.
A basal nodosaurid. So despite that initial lack of armor with the fossils, it's definitely back in the armored camp. What was the key evidence that convinced Pareda, Superbiola, and Barrett?
Well, they pointed to several key features in the bones. For instance, they noted a long tooth row in the jaw fragment and also a relatively low number of sacral vertebrae, those fused hip bones.
And those features match nodosaurids.
They're consistent with early basal nodosaurids, yeah. And also, because Seeley, the original discoverer, hadn't picked out a single specific fossil as the name bearer, the holotype.
Right, you need one definitive example.
You do. So Pareda, Superbiola, and Barrett selected one. A piece of the right scapula, the shoulder blade. It's cataloged as SMC B55731. They designated this as the lectotype.
Okay, the lectotype. And why that piece?
Because that particular bone shows a feature called a high acromion process. It's a bony projection on the shoulder blade, which is seen in ankylosaurs. It strongly supports putting it in that group.
Ah, okay. A solid anatomical link.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other fossils Seeley found back in Reach, they were designated as paralectotypes, basically supporting specimens that belong to the same species.
Right. And what about that initial puzzle? The lack of armor plates that gave Anoplosaurus its unarmored name? How do Pareda, Superbiola, and Barrett explain that now, if it is a nodosaurid?
Well, their suggestion, which makes a lot of sense, is that the lack of preserved armor in that original specimen might simply be because it was a young individual.
Oh, like maybe it hadn't fully grown its armor yet?
Precisely. In many dinosaurs and animals today, juveniles can look quite different from adults. Extensive armor plating might have been something that developed more fully later in life. So the original specimen might just have been too young to have much or any obvious armor preserved.
That makes perfect sense. It ties that loose end up nicely. Now, you mentioned earlier there was also some uncertainty about exactly where the fossils came from, something about the rock layer.
Yeah, that's another interesting little detail. It relates to the provenance, the origin of the fossils. Traditionally, they were thought to come from the Cambridge greensand,
Okay.
which is a geological deposit known for having reworked marine fossils, basically. Fossils washed out of older rocks and redeposited.
Right, so things can get mixed up.
Exactly. But Paredes Huber and Barrett noted that the Anoplosaurus bones seemed to belong to just one single individual,
Hmm.
which made them think, well, maybe it's less likely they came from a heavily reworked deposit where bones usually get scattered and mixed. They raised the possibility that the fossils might actually have come from the layer below, the upper Gault clay.
Which is also from the same general time
Yeah.
period.
Yeah, also Albian age, late early Cretaceous,
Yeah.
but perhaps less likely to be so jumbled. It's just a point about trying to pin down the exact context.
Got it. Okay, so pulling all these different threads together then, what's the current scientific consensus on Anoplosaurus cretaceous? What would this dinosaur, originally called the unarmored lizard, have actually been like?
Okay, so the prevailing view, the consensus today, is that Anoplosaurus cretaceous is considered a potentially valid taxon.
Meaning a real distinct species.
Yes, a legitimate species, and it's seen as a member of the Ankylosauridae, specifically within the Nodosauridae family, likely a basal one.
Right.
So what does that mean it looked like? Well, even though the original find didn't have armor, we'd reconstruct it as a typical nodosaurid.
Right.
Probably quadrupedal, walking on four legs.
Low slung.
Low slung, yeah, relatively close to the ground. A herbivore,
Hmm?
eating plants. And crucially, it would likely have possessed bony plates, maybe spines, embedded in its skin for protection.
Even if none were found with that first specimen.
Exactly, based on its family ties. So yeah, the dinosaur initially named unarmored lizard was almost certainly armored after all.
That really is a fantastic aha moment, resolving that initial puzzle. It completely flips the name on its head.
It does. It's a great story of scientific detective work.
It truly is. And just to wrap this part up, the Wikipedia entry mentions a few key research papers. Why are these particular ones highlighted? What's their significance?
Well, they represent sort of key milestones in figuring out this dinosaur. Seeley's original 1879 paper is foundational, obviously. It's where the genus Anoplosaurus was first described and named.
The starting point.
The starting point.
Okay.
Then, that 1999 review by Paredes Huber and Barrett, technically published in 1999, based on the 1998 work that was pivotal. It reevaluated everything in light of, decades of other discoveries.
Right.
And that's what really established the modern interpretation of Anoplosaurus as a basal nodosaurid. So these papers, along with, of course, lots of other research on ankylosaurs in general, they really show that ongoing scientific process. Each study builds on what came before, refining our picture of these amazing extinct animals.
So this whole deep dive into Anoplosaurus, it really shows, doesn't it, how our understanding of the prehistoric world isn't static at all. It's dynamic. It's constantly being refined, reevaluated.
Absolutely. New finds, new ways of looking at old finds.
Right. And this initial puzzle, the unarmored lizard, it hasn't just been solved, but the journey to solve it gives us, I think, a much deeper appreciation for just how complex dinosaur evolution was, and also how the scientific process itself works, correcting itself over time.
It's a perfect example.
So what does this tell you, the listener, about how we interpret evidence today? Not just in paleontology, I mean, but, well, in any field of knowledge.
Yeah, that's a really profound point to end on, I think. It speaks volumes about the tentative nature of knowledge sometimes. Our interpretations, they're always shaped by the evidence we have at that moment.
Right. Limited by what we know now.
Exactly. And as that evidence grows, or as our tools, our methods of analysis get better, our understanding can change. Sometimes, like with Anoplosaurus, in really quite surprising ways.
So, it's just a really valuable reminder, isn't it? To keep a critical perspective, always be open to new information, and, continuously question the assumptions that kind of underpin how we understand the world, whatever the subject might be.